Hey everyone, and welcome back to the channel. In today's video I'm going to be taking a look at every tank spec and how they're shaping up on the Shadowlands beta. I'm also going to be ranking them based on their current strength in Mythic Plus, focusing on areas like damage, survivability, utility, and their reliance on a healer. I will be putting out videos specific to each tank spec in the near future that will go more in depth on all the changes they've seen in Shadowlands, so keep an eye out for those. I'll also be looking at how all the healer specs fare in Mythic Plus in a future video as well. In terms of why you should care about what I have to say, I played Guardian Druid and Prot Warrior mostly this past season in 8.3 and pushed keys up to plus 23s. So while I'm not the best tank player in the world, I do have a decent amount of knowledge when it comes to tanking higher keys. Tanking Mythic Plus dungeons and pushing high keys is one of my favorite things to do in WoW, so I decided to put research and testing that I was doing on tanks on the beta into a video for you guys here. Before we jump into the tanks, I did want to give a couple disclaimers. First, every single tank spec can complete Keystone Master, which is all dungeons on a plus 15, in time without issue. If that's all you're worried about, I definitely recommend playing the spec that you like the most. Tanks kind of fall into this spot where there's a lot more to them outside of what class they're playing. They dictate the routes and the pace of the entire dungeon, so the class becomes less important compared to how skilled they are at pacing the dungeon correctly. Second, this is still beta. With the Shadowlands release date pushed back, there's still some tuning that's going to happen, particularly with Covenants. I'm going to mostly exclude Covenants from this conversation because of this, but I'll take a closer look at them in the individual spec videos. Tank balance is also extremely close at the moment, with most of the tanks being fairly equivalent just with a different set of strengths and weaknesses. Also, just a quick reminder guys that our Shadowlands giveaway is still going on until October 16th, so check out the gleam.io link in the description to enter. Now without further ado, let's jump into our B tier tanks. These are 3 tank specs that, while having strengths, are definitely lacking in certain areas. To start things off, let's look at Blood Death Knights. While they were looking to be quite strong only a few weeks ago, nerfs to their top Covenant ability and Legendary have really hurt Blood DKs, both in terms of their damage output and survivability, though they do still have their great utility and mob control. When it comes to damage, Blood DKs are really struggling at the moment. Currently, they rely on their one big AoE damage cooldown in Bone Storm to hold aggro, but in pulls where this isn't available, they really struggle. And for those of you wondering, yes, threat is an issue for many tanks currently on the beta, mostly due to them having weak damage, either from the target cap or just lacking stats. If we look at Blood DK survivability, they are one of 2 tanks that is currently at risk of being one-shot when you start pushing keys higher. While they have a lot of self-healing and don't need to rely on a healer as much as other tanks do, it's kind of hard to self-heal when you're dead in a global. It isn't all bad for DKs though. They still have a bunch of utility with abilities like Death Grip and Gorfiend's Grasp for mob control, Grip of the Dead for kiting, and the recently re-added Anti-Magic Zone for party-wide magic damage reduction. They are also one of only 2 tanks that can battle res. Anti-Magic Barrier is also quite useful, which allows DKs to avoid applications of certain magic effects as well as things like Necrotic. Essentially, while Blood DKs have some great utility and the best self-healing of any tank, they are definitely lacking in terms of both damage output and mitigation, resulting in them having threat problems and feeling squishy on high keys. Next up in the B tier we have Prot Warriors. The kings of BFA have been knocked down a peg here in Shadowlands. This is mostly due to their talent tree being rearranged, which reduces the number of synergies they can run with, and that combined with the reduced stat level on the class that really needs gear to shine, makes them a shadow of their former selves. Due to the talent tree changes, the Thunderclap spam build that is often used on live is quite a bit weaker, but still playable. It also has great synergy with the Thunderlord legendary, which is making a return. Going with this setup yields a lot less damage than it does currently, which can result in some threat issues. They're also now forced to give up talents like Bolster in favor of a nerfed Anger Management, which results in worse mitigation. Due to this, some warriors are opting to run burstier builds with short cooldowns like Dragon's Roar and Ravager that they can cycle in order to help them keep threat. In terms of survivability, they have slowly become one of the best tanks at mitigating physical damage, thanks to several buffs to Vanguard. They are still very weak when it comes to bleeds and magic damage, especially after the nerfs to the Spell Reflect legendary. While the talent nerfs and lower gear levels do mean that warriors have noticeable gaps in their mitigation, they are still able to line it up so that they have long periods of time with 100% mitigation. They do suffer from a lack of self-healing and sustain, making them one of the more healer-reliant tanks. In terms of their utility, Prot Warriors don't have as much as some of the other tank specs. The AoE stun from Shockwave is always valuable, and they gained an AoE taunt in Shadowlands. They have some niche abilities like Shattering Throw and Intimidating Shout, a mediocre defensive and Rallying Cry, and Battle Shout, which suffers from being entirely dependent on your group composition to gain value. Overall, Prot Warriors are not as powerful in Shadowlands as they currently are in BFA. They have taken a hit to their damage and survivability and are quite healer reliant, especially with low gear levels. While they aren't the best tank out there in Season 1, they do tend to scale very favorably over the course of an expansion as gear levels rise, so I expect them to move up this list as we go deeper into Shadowlands. Rounding out the B tier, we have Brewmaster Monks. While they've been a mainstay in high-end Mythic raiding, a lot of what makes them valuable in a raid environment gets diminished when moving to Mythic Plus. One of Brewmaster's biggest issues in the first season will be threat, as they are one of the two worst offenders when it comes to snap threat and AoE situations due to their lack of AoE burst damage. Over the last several builds, they've also received a couple nerfs to both Keg Smash and the Keg Smash Legendary, making this weakness more prevalent. They can opt to take a talent in Black Ox Statue, which can partially help with this, but to do so you have to give up one of the best dungeon utility spells in the game in Ring of Peace. They did gain Touch of Death, which can help them quickly finish off priority targets, but outside of this one strength, Monks fall behind as one of the lowest overall damage tanks in dungeons. If we look at their survivability, Brewmasters are one of the best. The addition of Celestial Brew is very helpful, even if it's just a weaker version of the old guard. Expel Harm also got a sizable healing buff, granting monks a little bit more self-healing. Their bread and butter is Stagger, which is still strong and makes them very hard to kill, but it also requires them to rely on healers much more than other tanks. Brewmasters need fairly constant attention, which can be a downside in high keys where you want your healer to contribute as much damage as possible. On the plus side, it does synergize extremely well with one of the top healers, Resto Druids, thanks to their kit being full of healing over time spells. When it comes to utility, monks bring a ton to the table, with things like Mystic Touch, Leg Sweep, Detox, Tiger's Lust, Paralysis, and of course Ring of Peace. Unfortunately for Mystic Touch, it suffers from a similar problem that Warrior's Battle Shout does, where its value is entirely dependent on your group composition. Detox is fantastic if your healer is lacking a poison or disease dispel, but otherwise it's not extremely useful. Tiger's Lust is similar to Blessing of Freedom and is great for getting either yourself or your party members out of bad situations. When combined with the great mobility of monks, it enables them to create a lot of space between themselves and the mobs, making it much easier to kite, assuming they can keep aggro, of course. Ring of Peace adds on to this, making it easy for them to drop stacks of necrotic, as well as move mobs out of sanguine puddles or stop spiteful ads from reaching your party members. Circling back to monk legendaries, they probably have the weakest out of any of the tank classes, opting to use the neutral Vitality Sacrifice over any of their class specific ones, especially after the recent nerfs to the Keg Smash Legendary. This means that unless something changes, if players are able to equip a second legendary later on in the expansion, monks could end up falling behind due to their lack of powerful options. In the end, Brewmasters have some great utility and fantastic mitigation thanks to Stagger, but their damage output is really lacking. While they are never really concerned about being a one-shot, if you aren't grouped with a DPS that can misdirect you, you will definitely notice your threat issues. Stagger also has the consequence of causing your healer to spend more time focusing on you, which isn't a problem for healers like Resto Druids, but can drastically reduce the DPS uptime of other heal specs. Precariously perched in the A tier, we have Guardian Druids. Guardians have a simple but extremely effective mitigation with Iron Fur, making them one of the better tanks at mitigating physical damage. Their gaps in mitigation and weakness to magic damage can be covered up by a couple of the more powerful legendaries available to tanks, with access to both Ursoc's Fury Remembered and the Natural Order's Will. This puts them in the awkward position where nerfs to these legendaries could push them down this list prior to launch. If we look at the Barkskin legendary, it gives a solid damage reduction buff, and when combined with the multiple ways bears can reduce the cooldown of Barkskin, it gives them a very high uptime. This makes Guardians extremely tanky in all situations, however it doesn't provide them with a much needed damage boost, which causes them to struggle on threat. If they opt for the Thrash Absorb legendary, bears get this Feast or Famine playstyle, where they feel absolutely invincible during Incarnation, but outside of it they have a ton of mitigation gaps and rely on Thrash procs for damage and aggro, which can be inconsistent at best. Combined with these legendaries, bears do have some solid utility, with access to spells like Typhoon and Ursul's Vortex for mob control and kiting, Remove Corruption for if your healer is lacking a poison or curse, Stampeding Roar for a solid party-wide move speed boost that synergizes well with Shrouding indoors, and of course, Battle Res. They also have some niche utility with spells like Mass Entanglement and Incapacitating Roar, as well as a decent amount of self-healing, so they aren't as reliant on healers compared to tanks like Brewmaster or Prot Warriors. Overall, bears can cover up most of their weaknesses right now thanks to some powerful legendaries, but they could fall down this list if those legendaries see nerfs. They also struggle in most scenarios when it comes to threat, so they rely on a misdirect, similar to Brewmasters. They are a spec to keep an eye out for further into the expansion, however, as if we ever get to equip 2 legendaries instead of 1 like in Legion, bears could jump up to the top of this list. To finish off the A tier, we have Prot Paladins. Often referred to as the glass cannon of tanks, they are quite squishy along with their DK counterparts, but are able to partially mitigate this by having extremely high uptime on Ardent Defender thanks to a pretty powerful conduit. This means that in higher keys, where they're usually afraid of being one-shot, they do have the safety of a cheat death to fall back on. They also aren't a slouch when it comes to self or group healing, as they can pump out Words of Glory and flash heals if needed. Despite being quite frail, Paladins bring the highest damage out of any tank. Their high base damage is complemented by several powerful legendaries, including the popular Bulwark of Righteous Fury and the more defensive Holy Avenger's Engraved Sigil. This leads to Paladins being absolute monsters in AoE situations such as Mythic Plus, and also means they are one of the few tanks that don't struggle with aggro. In addition to their high damage output, Paladins also bring a ton of utility. Immunities like Divine Shield and Blessing of Protection are always powerful, as they can be used to cheese a plethora of mechanics, especially once abilities get into one-shot range and high keys. They also bring Blessing of Sacrifice and Freedom, as well as Lay on Hands, which all have a fair amount of uses. They have access to things like Cleanse, which helps if your healer isn't able to dispel poisons or diseases, and something that shouldn't be overlooked is the utility of Avenger's Shield, as it allows Paladins to chain interrupt in AoE situations without the help of other party members, which is especially useful if the meta shapes up to have a lot of ranged DPS classes. They also provide a passive 3% damage reduction for your entire group with Devotion Aura. So while Prot Paladins are quite squishy compared to other tanks, they make up for this with an insane amount of utility and the strongest damage out of any tank spec, leading to few, if any, problems with threat. They also have access to some powerful legendaries, which could make them even stronger down the line in the expansion. Finally, we have our only S tier tank, the Vengeance Demon Hunter. Demon Hunters offer a great balance of damage, tankiness, self-healing, and utility, giving them the top spot on this list. Starting off with their damage, Demon Hunters can't quite pump out the big numbers that Paladins can, but they are still up there. This is mostly due to having a ton of AoE damage spells, including Soul Cleave, Sigil of Flame, Immolation Aura, the talent Spirit Bomb, and the 1-minute cooldown Fell Devastation. Overall, I'd say they're the second highest damaging tank, and like Paladins, don't have many, if any, threat issues. When it comes to survivability, they have a mix of long and short cooldowns that give them a fairly high overall uptime, with abilities like Metamorphosis, Fiery Brand, Demon Spikes, and Fell Devastation combined with a Demonic talent. They also have access to a cheat death in Last Resort, albeit on an 8-minute cooldown. They can have some gaps in their mitigation, but they aren't as bad as they've been in the past and can be played around. For self-healing, Demon Hunters don't quite reach the levels of Blood DKs, but again, I would say they are the second best, so they don't rely on their healer as much as most other tanks. When it comes to legendaries and builds, Demon Hunters have a couple options. They can choose the more defense, lower damage build with Spirit of the Darkness Flame, or they can opt for the Spirit Bomb build for higher damage that uses the neutral legendary Vitality Sacrifice. Regardless of what they choose, both builds are quite strong, with one favoring damage and the other survivability, which is extremely valuable in higher keys. In terms of utility, Demon Hunters provide a decent amount through their sigils, with mob control via Sigil of Chains, an AoE silence through Sigil of Silence, and an AoE disorient and Sigil of Misery. They also have a ranged CC from Imprison, and of course their boost to magic damage from Chaos Brand, which will gain or lose value depending on your group composition. Overall, while Demon Hunters aren't the best in any single category, they provide very good damage and self-healing with solid tankiness and utility. They are one of the top tanks in every category, with their only downside being some small gaps in their mitigation and having mid-tier legendaries. But there we have it, the current state of all 6 tank specs and dungeons on the Shadowlands beta. I will be putting out individual videos for all these specs in the weeks to come that go more in depth, as well as a video talking about healers in Mythic Plus. If you enjoyed this video and are interested in more Warcraft content, feel free to subscribe. You can also check me out on Twitch or follow me on Twitter for updates, both at Tactics. Also, a reminder that our Shadowlands giveaway ends on October 16th, so check out the link in the description to enter. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video.